Hello everyone, my name is Jan Harris. I'm a principal front-end engineer. A lot had happened in the last couple of months, and my workflow had completely changed in a way that I built software. I would like to share with you today changes to my workflow, what tools I'm using, how much do I still code manually, and how much do I let AI and agents code for me, how I continuously ensure that I get better results every day, and also how I can now do multiple parallel projects all at once. And the only thing that I seem to be missing is multiple monitors to monitor everything that's happening. Well, first and foremost, welcome back. I know it's been a minute. I know there are a lot of tools going around. There are some new releases by OpenAI. Obviously, Copilot is making many new improvements. However, due to the fact that I work at Amazon, I would like to share with you a VS Code plugin called Cline and how I use it every day for my day job as well as for my side projects. Let's get right into it. First of all, let's talk about the plugin that I'm using. The name of this plugin is Cline, and it can be installed in multiple IDEs. I am using Visual Studio Code, but you can see that it's also available for Cursor, Visual Studio Code Insider, and Windsurf. While I'm using an internal fork of Cline, I'm going to be talking about the external version today, which is available for anyone who has one of those IDEs installed on their machine. I also highly recommend exploring Cline blog. Every time they publish a new feature or they're trying to explain how to use existing features, they have a lot of very good content on their blog. The posts that I personally keep going back to are the memory bank post, the workflow post, and obviously any update that's coming up. I'm coming over here to the blog to make sure I understand what it means and how to use it. Now, once I install Cline in my Visual Studio Code, I have an easy access to it through my plugins menu on the left side. When clicking on the Cline icon, I see a landing page. So now you see a couple of different tasks that I've been trying to complete earlier. But if you're using this for the first time, you're going to have your empty screen. And obviously the key is going to be the input field where you go to start your first task and go to start with prompt. But before we dive into a specific example of the work that you can do with Cline, let's see what it has to offer in that interface. Now, a very important menu is going to be the model selection menu. I'm going to use Anthropic's Sonnet 3.7. Currently internally at Amazon, some of the newer models, which are Sonnet 4.0 and Opus 4.0, do have limited capacity. 3.7 is going to give me very good reasoning. And at the same time, I'm not going to receive as much throttling. And I'm going to say that Claude is probably going to be my preference when it comes to generating code. In API configuration, you're going to have to choose and define your AWS account. I am using internal corporate account for this, but to get access to any of those models and to be able to leverage them for generating code, you're going to have to register with AWS and provide your authentication information here in Cline API configuration. Once that's done and you are basically able to connect to your model of choice, you can start giving it prompts and asking to generate code. However, for a new project or an existing project, I really recommend to start with defining Cline rules and generating the memory bank. What you want to do before you get started is to create a memory folder. In this folder, I'm going to create a Cline rules file. This is something I copied directly from the Cline getting started instructions. I simply copy paste it into the Cline rules file and save it. It's going to give instructions on how to generate memory bank for my project. These instructions are pretty generic, so you're welcome to go read through it and modify it however you'd like. But I'm going to just go with generic and see what you get from it. So now in my Cline prompt input field, I'm going to say generate memory bank following Cline rules. There are a couple of things that I really like about working with Cline. One of them is a very neat UI feature that gives you a good idea of what does your context window currently look like. When you hover over each of those blocks, it essentially gives you a snippet of what data is occupying this section within the context window. And since context window is going to be a sliding window, over time for long-running tasks, you will start seeing how this context window continues to slide towards the right side and consequentially dropping some of the context that it had in the beginning. Here I have a simple prototype, a project that has a couple of pages, it has a chat interface, and it connects to my custom Bedrock agent. Cline was able to go through all the files, identify what those files are responsible for, and as you can see, it starts generating memory bank files. It's going to generate project brief, project context. It's going to describe system patterns. It's also documenting tech context. It continues by adding the activity context. It describes the recent change, UX decisions, code organization, style and approach, state management. And it also makes an assessment of what's working well and what are the current challenges. And last but not least, it's going to create a progress file documenting what has been done, what client thinks still needs to be done, and obviously you're welcome to modify this file manually afterwards. Once client thinks it had successfully completed the task, it will give you a task completed checkbox and a summary of what had been done in a green color. And I'm sure you have noticed that it's also given me an estimation of how much this work had cost me, or rather my organization. So this is a very important and really useful indication for me to know how to manage my AI generation work. Is it really worth it for me to do a task with Cline and an LLM versus doing it manually? And a lot of it really comes down to making sure that the way you work with Cline and the way that you do your prompt engineering is effective and efficient. So this is a great indicator to watch out for. I will start a new task, but before we continue, I would like to show you one more Cline concept, and it is a workflow. I already have a workflow created, and in a way, it can be a continuation of the tech context. But in fact, what I use it for is to give specific instructions to Cline every time I'm trying to do a specific task. I have a front-end workflow over here, and this front-end workflow defines which design system I am intended to use. It defines how I prefer styling to be done, what are specific rules of styling, and if there is any other resource that would like Cline to use when doing front-end engineering work to be able to follow my preferred guidelines. One of such resources can be your local memory bank. However, we're seeing more and more often where multiple engineers or teams would like to actually collaborate on a useful context and make that context available on a broader scope. A most useful example of such context can be developer documentation. When it comes to front-end engineering, I really would like to make as much information available to Cline about my design system and my component library as possible, so that it doesn't attempt creating components from scratch with generic HTML and CSS, but instead is using my component library. Within the workflow, I can specify where this type of information and context can be reached. And ideally, I don't want to keep this type of information within the workflow itself. So now we're coming up to the configuration piece that I would like to cover, which is a set of MCP servers that you might find useful for your front-end work within Cline. Within my MCP servers panel, I click on installed, and I have a couple of internal Amazon MCP servers, but I also have a couple of key servers that I think you will find useful as well. And is relevant to the shareable context that I was mentioning earlier, and that is an AWS knowledge base MCP server. This MCP server is open sourced and available on GitHub for anyone to download and run locally. This is exactly what I'm doing here. And in my configuration for this AWS knowledge base MCP server, I'm actually defining which knowledge base I would like for the server to hit. All I need is my knowledge base ID. And obviously prior to it, I had to go through authentication steps to make sure I have an IAM role and a profile, approving my requests to this knowledge base so that I can reach this content successfully. Through this open source generic AWS knowledge base MCP server, I am able to connect to my Bedrock knowledge base, which contains information about my design system and my component library. This information is extremely valuable to me because every time I'm trying to generate front-end with Cline, all I do is I pass my workflow. My workflow is asking Cline to reach out to the knowledge base and learn about my component library so that Cline can generate front-end code using my component library in my design system instead of using generic HTML, tags, and CSS. And last but not least is the Figma MCP server. There are a couple of Figma MCP servers available on GitHub as an open source. I find they all are generally pretty useful. Your success in using Figma MCP server is going to depend on how your Figma file is structured and the quality of metadata that you're able to get from Figma so that your LLM can successfully interpret this data and map your Figma components to your design system with code. Now, as I mentioned, I have a simple web application that has a canvas next to the chat interface and a column view. I would like to add a header to this interface, and this header is supposed to use my design system and have an application name in it as well as the project ID. I start with typing in my front-end workflow. This MD file already has all the key instructions that are necessary to make this a success. Now I'm going to type in my prompt. Once I type in my prompt, I'm just going to hit enter and see how the work goes. First and foremost, Cline is going to plan this work. In fact, you can start in the plan mode instead of an act mode. Keep iterating on the plan as you go. My approach is indeed to start in a plan mode and continue to work with Cline to iron out the plan before it starts taking any actions. That can save you on overall cost by avoiding an LLM going down the path that you do not prefer it to take. But for the purposes of this demo, we're going to work in an act mode. That the client is reaching out to my Bedrock knowledge base through an MCP server connection. It's asking about various components, a couple that I mentioned in my prompt. Now that it has a plan and context that it thinks is relevant and sufficient, is going to start building this component. The key thing here is to notice how it's using my design system. It's using the dial-in approach that I prefer. It's using my design tokens instead of hard coding values. So we did end up building a few custom components, but for other things like headers and text, as well as avatar, it continues to use components directly from my design system. It's going to have some TypeScript errors, but that's okay. Cline is going to go back and fix those errors. It doesn't always get things perfectly. So in fact, over here, I went and I modified something manually so that I don't have to spend cycles going in and trying to fix something that I already know how to fix very quickly. Once I do that, I save this change. Cline actually notices that user had made some edits and makes a note of it as well. Now it's going to bring my header component into the workspace that is supposed to use it. You also notice that it is using one of my previous directives to use row and column components whenever possible. It is changing some layout based on the fact that it's adding a header, and I'm going to go ahead and save this change. Now it's going to run the command that I found in my project JSON file to be able to identify whether those local changes have been successful. The only challenge is, even to run my project locally, I actually have to go through an authentication process. And if Cline were to try and launch it in a Cline browser, which is a built-in feature of Cline, it actually would stumble upon the authentication step and won't be able to see if the change was successful. It works better if you are testing your changes in a storybook setup. The storybook will not require authentication, and Cline will successfully be able to launch your storybook change within the Cline browser interface and identify whether the change has been successful and whether it's up to your requirements. Cline can not only look at the layout of the interface and assess whether it's fitting the original requirement of the task, but it can also interact with this interface if the interaction is required for integration testing. And I've seen it run end-to-end testing inside of the Cline browser, which has been pretty impressive for me to watch. So at this point in time, it looks like Cline had successfully implemented my header component. I have looked at it in the browser and it looks great. Obviously, I can continue to work with this and refine it further, but my hope is that you had grasped my basic workflow setup for Cline. And please leave any questions in the comment section if you would like to test it for your own workflow and your own developer environment setup. And that's a wrap. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe if you'd like to hear more about my agentic AI coding workflow, the tricks and best practices that I'm using as the landscape continues to evolve. And until the next time.